Folks, this chapter represents almost like a transition of sorts in this training series. We're going to be going from kind of initiatory After Effects features to more significant, complex, and advanced ones, starting with, in this chapter, 3D. We're going to take this map of this olive farm, and we're going to bring this to life by making these elements 3D. This is a significantly more complex project than we've seen before. It's much more like a real-world After Effects project. There are 42 visible layers in this, so there's a lot to play with. And what we're going to do is we're going to take some of these layers. Again, this is just from a flat Illustrator file, just a regular old run-of-the-mill graphics file. And we are going to make this come alive by moving these pieces of this map in 3D space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this icon number 2. Just select this. This is layer number 6. Go ahead and select that layer. And what we're going to do is hit the letter P for position. And we want to make sure that we're seeing the switches area, these little icons here. If not, you can go ahead and click on the toggle switches and modes button. And if you look over here, there's a cube. And this column indicates the ability to make a layer 3-dimensional. Now, if you're familiar with like Shrek and stuff like that, in other words, 3D objects, you might be a little bit confused by what's going on with After Effects. In After Effects, we don't really create 3-dimensional objects typically. With the 3D in After Effects, usually what we mean is the 3D world, a 3D environment. So the object itself remains flat, like a piece of paper. But when we make a regular old 2D layer 3-dimensional, what that gives us is the power and ability to move that in 3D space. And if you could move things in 3D space, then you could simulate 3 dimensions, which is very powerful. It sounds like very amateurish just to move flat things in space, but if done correctly, the result is really powerful. So we're going to go to this cube checkbox on icon 2, and we're going to check that. Now, not very much seemed to happen. The layer looks the same. But really what has happened is that we now, if you see what happened with position, it added a 3rd dimension. We know about X, left and right. We know about Y, up and down. And now that the layer is 3D, we have Z. In other words, it is closer to us and farther away from us. Now, until you have multiple 3-dimensional layers in your scene, then it's going to look like you're just scaling up and down an object. When you move it along the Z-axis, as it's coming closer toward you and farther apart, it's basically just going to look like you're scaling it up and down. But if we combine that with other layers, let's say, for example, this tree right here behind it. This tree is the tree frontmost layer, layer number 15. I'm going to go ahead and make this a 3-dimensional layer by clicking its cube icon and hit P for position. And then we play with position here. Adjust that, maybe bring that up closer to icon 2. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change the view using this drop-down that says active camera by default. I'm going to change this to the top view. So now we're seeing the top view of the layers. These views are only good for 3-dimensional layers, so we're only seeing 2 little lines here. But we can see that we now have this relationship between these 2 layers. And just for a reference, let's go ahead and put icon 3, 4, and 5 in 3 dimensions as well. And so we see that they are aligned with the ground plane, the initial place where all objects are. And we've aligned icon 2 and the tree layer, which we can adjust here. We can click and drag on these little arrows to adjust along this axis. But we can see that we have adjusted them in space now so that the tree that we created in 3D is now in front of icon number 2. So because this is the top view, think of the viewer as sitting right here, almost as if we were in a movie theater, and this is the movie screen, and the audience would be down here at the bottom of the screen. So this view is to help you kind of get situated in 3D space. If it's more helpful for you, I'm going to take this back to active camera. You can go to the drop down to the right of that and change this from 1 view to 4 views. So now you can see different views of the object. So now we are seeing our 3-dimensional objects. We're seeing the icons, and I could zoom in here and see the icons and the tree. And here we're seeing the right view. So we have the regular icons, and then we have the tree, and then the main icon back here. And you can see also, if we zoom in here, that even though in the original design, the tree was behind the icon, now because we've arranged them in 3D space so that the icon is behind the tree is obscuring the view of the icon. And so we can grab this along the right edge. Again, using our movie theater analogy, it's almost like we're looking at the side of the movie theater where the right side is the movie screen pointed to the left, and the audience would be here on the left watching the screens to the right. So we can grab the arrow in Z space here and move this in front of the tree. And you can see the difference in the front view of what that looks like. So here's the icon in front. Move it behind the tree. You can see it in back. So we're basically, again, staggering these layers in 3 dimensions. I'll take this back to one view here. A piece like this, and I separated this into tons of different layers. Every tree is its own layer. That's what will create the most 3D depth, is if each of these trees are its own layer and they move in 3 dimensions, it will add a lot to the realism. But the problem is that when you have a layer this complex or a project this complex, it is very time consuming to arrange all of these objects in 3D space. But that is just what you need to do. That is the name of the game. But once you have arranged these objects in 3D space, and then what we could do is create a camera and move around this scene in a very realistic and lifelike way. One rule I want to point out before we get into talking about that in the next movie is that there are some rules with 2D and 3D layers. And one is that 2D layers don't play the 3D game. So, for example, I have this frame layer at the top, and I'll go ahead and take off the visibility so you can see this outline, this frame. If the frame layer is 3D, and let's go down to the choo-choo tracks layer. It's like the railroad tracks. I called it choo-choo tracks. So I'm going to make the choo-choo tracks layer 3D as well. So the frame is 3D and the choo-choo tracks are 3D. And I'm going to select choo-choo tracks and press P to reveal its position. If I adjust this in Z space, I can at some point bring this layer in front of the frame layer. In other words, the 3D-ness allows layers to go in front of each other, even above. It like overrides the layer stacking order. So as we saw with icon 2 and the tree, even though the icon 2 layer is on top, we're able to go back and forth between those 2 layers because they exist in 3D space. And I'm going to go ahead and try to, let's actually go to a 4 view here. And we have our railroad track. And if we were to move this around, at some point, the choo-choo tracks, for some reason that's not working, maybe because the stacking order is too high. But at some point, the railroad tracks can overlap the frame. They can go in front of this frame. So if we wanted to make sure that the frame was always in front, then we would make it a 2-dimensional layer. We'd make sure that it stayed 2D. Same thing with the background. Usually when you have a background like this, I'll take this back to one view here. When you have a background like a solid color like this, you typically want to keep that in 2 dimensions so that way nothing goes behind it. So basically, if you have a 3D layer, then the layer order doesn't matter. It will go in front of and back of whatever objects are in 3D space. But if you have 2D layers, they cannot defy the layer order. So what is in front will always remain in front. What is in back will always remain in back if those layers are 2D layers. So what I'm going to do between now and when I see you in the next movie, I'm going to arrange these objects in 3D space. I'm just going to go, let's say, for example, the left barn big. I'm going to hit P. I'm going to make this a 3D layer. I'm going to adjust this in Z space. And then I could go to the left barn small layer. Again, make this a 3D layer. Adjust the Z space. As you can see, they can override the layer order because of the fact they're both 3D layers. But I'm going to adjust everything staggered in 3-dimensional space so that we have, again, a series of layers in 3D. And I'll show you what that looks like in the next movie. And we'll also add some lights and cameras to increase the realism and give some 3D movement to the scene. So now we're going to bring this to life by using a light and a camera. Before we do that, I just want to share with you what I did since the last movie here. Negative Z values actually bring object closer to the camera, closer to you, closer to your view. And so what I did is I took these icons and I gave them negative values, as you can see towards the top here, like negative 165 for icon 5 and so on and so forth. And then there are kind of like key plane, like 0 plane objects, and the path is kind of one of those ones I don't really want to move very much. Same thing with the bridges. So I kind of want those to be at 0. So if we go down to the path, it's about -7. So it's a little bit closer to the viewer, which is good. A little bit of depth is okay. But then I put like the shadows underneath the trees, and actually these trees way, way, way back here, right here, the faded background tree layer. If I turn this off and on, those layers have a high positive value, which pushes them farther away from the camera. So the shadows and these little curvy lines here, those things, again, are farther in the background. So we have things staggered in 3D space. If we look at the 4 view, we can see that the right view, we have a lot of things staggered here. The top view, again, and this is where the audience is looking this way in the top view. And so we have a lot of different layers here, a lot of different Z depth dimension objects, which is really good. That's what we want. So I'm going to take this back to one view. And now to see all the glory that we've created, actually first let's clean up our layers a little bit. I'm going to select one layer, hit Command A or Control A to select all, and then hit Shift and the tilde key, the little squiggle next to the number 1 on the keyboard. Shift tilde to collapse all these layers, to shrink them down so it's a little bit more manageable. And then we're going to right click in some blank area of the timeline panel, like right here, usually to the left of layer's name, to get this pop-up dialog box. And you right click, and I'm going to choose New Camera. I'm just going to go ahead and set the default settings. If you're familiar with camera work, you'll notice a lot of the similar settings here, such as your angle of view, your zoom. There's even like different lenses. And what you can try to do is try to match up, if you're going to do some compositing, you try to shoot up your virtual camera here in After Effects with the actual lens that you used in the field. Now, that's how it works in theory. There's actually a little bit more in terms of variables to it, so it doesn't always work like that. But as a general rule, that's how things go. Regardless, I'm just going to leave all settings as is and click OK. And by default, you won't notice too much because the default lens is a 50mm lens. And the 50mm lens is very similar to the way After Effects naturally renders things. So to really see the depth that we have in our scene, we're going to use this tool. This is the Unified Camera tool, which is pretty cool. If you click and drag left and right, you'll orbit around the scene with your camera. And actually, let me zoom in here so you can see this a little bit more closely. Click and drag and you zoom around. And so we're getting a three-dimensional view of our scene. And you can see the faded background tree in the background here and the shadows moving more in one direction, and then the icons in the front and even the houses moving in a different direction. You could move up and you can move down. And so by staggering these flat layers in 3 dimensions, we've created a real 3-dimensional scene. Of course, if we were to keep orbiting the camera, then the joke would be up because we'd be able to totally see what's going on. And as we turn to the side, you could see again that these are just a series of flat layers. But assuming you don't do that, this illusion is a very cool look. Now with the Unified Camera tool, if you have a 3-button mouse, you could hold down the middle mouse button to pan around, and you could hold the right mouse button down to zoom in and zoom out. So you have all 3 of these functions available to you in one Unified Camera tool. Now, if you've done any work on a film set, or if you have worked in photography at all, then you know that lighting makes all the difference in whether something looks good or whether something doesn't. So I'm going to go and right-click in the same way we created a new camera, and I'm going to create a new light. And I'm just going to keep this as a spotlight because they have the most dramatic effect. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And by default, the light is zoomed in such a way that we can't see the light really. Most of our objects are in darkness. Actually, let me show you what this light looks like here. I'm going to go to the top view. And really what this light is, it's a light source, and then we have a little point that shows us the direction of the light. So we could actually move the light and the light source at the same time, or we could move just where it's being pointed and leave the light actually where it is. So I'm going to take this back to the active camera view, and then I'm going to click the light source on Z space and click and drag and pull this back so we can see more of our objects. Now, the way I typically like to do things, unless I have a specific purpose not to do this, but one of the things I like to do is to leave a little bit of the cone from the light in there. So we have this fall off, and that adds so much realism to what's going on. Now, if, for example, we wanted to focus on bar number 3, then from a design point of view, this would not be that good. So we might want to grab the angle here and put more light on number 3. But all things considered, if we can do that, to have a little bit of fall off, again, it adds so much more realism to what's going on. So then we could grab our camera and the Unified Camera tool and click and drag around, and we have a very realistic 3D scene. It almost looks as if we cut these things out on paper and really filmed them. It's really a great look. In the next movie, we're going to look at how to add shadows to this.